My name is Argesh. I'm an American volunteer from YPG. I went to Rojava in late May of 2017 and joined the IFB and the campaign to liberate Raqqa from Daesh. After that, I went to work in the civil side for a few months in Kamuslo with the YPG, which is the Institute for the Solidarity and Unity of the People. And then with the Turkish invasion of Afrin, I went with Devrimci Güçleri, the Turkish left's revolutionary forces, to defend Afrin, and was there until March when we were sent back to Jazeera Canton. And since then, I've returned to Europe to give conferences and work with the Kurdish freedom movement here. What exactly happened in Afrin? Because we're facing a similar scenario today, that the Turkish state is upping its rhetoric. It's talking about a full-scale invasion of Rojava to completely destroy anything of the existing system there. So I guess before we go there, we can understand maybe what exactly happened in Afrin, because we'll see, again, a repeat of what happened in Afrin, but on a larger scale. So let's explain what exactly Afrin is. It's a canton in northern Syria, and it's very shortly after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in the spring of 2012. With the withdrawal of Syrian government forces came the establishment of the autonomous self-administration of Afrin as part of the Rojava system. The people of Afrin had implemented a system based on women's liberation, direct democracy, multiculturalism, pluralism, and ecological revolution. While war and conflict raged and spread all around Syria, Afrin remained virtually untouched. As the war intensified, the peace and stability within Afrin made the canton a safe haven for countless refugees and IDPs fleeing the violence throughout the region. In Afrin, refugees and IDPs were welcomed by a system that viewed them as fellow humans and which treated them with dignity. As the democratic project continued to develop in Afrin, the people prospered. A multilingual education fostered multiculturalism and social cohesion. The women's revolution had liberated society and was rapidly dissolving the deep-seated patriarchal system that had violently oppressed women for centuries in less than 6 years. Afrin had become a vision for the future of true democracy, not only for Syria or the Middle East, but for the world. Despite the chaos that had engulfed most of Syria, Afrin, along with the other cantons of the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, were developing one of the most progressive and revolutionary direct democracies the world had ever seen. While this massive leap in humanity was organically occurring in Afrin, in the midst of a brutal civil war and against all odds, just across the border, the Turkish state was engaged in a high-speed retreat from the road to democracy and diving directly into the clutches of Erdogan's fascist regime. Once again, revealing its true nature, the fascist Turkish state labeled the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria as a threat to Turkish national security and as the center of terrorism. It was evident that the respective military and political successes of the globally supported YPG-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Democratic Council had unsurprisingly become intolerable to Erdogan and his fascist regime. However, it was not simply the fact that there was a truly democratic system growing along Turkey's southern border, or that the people were liberating themselves from Erdogan's Islamist proxies. What was the most infuriating, unfathomable, and unacceptable and terrifying for Erdogan was the simple fact that all of this progress came from a revolution that was based on an ideology developed by the Kurdish freedom movement. For Erdogan and his fascist regime, Afrin was the epicenter of everything he and his government despised. Its existence and success defied him and gave hope to the oppressed people inside of Turkey. The Turkish state, under Erdogan's direction, began preparations for a full-scale military invasion of Afrin. According to international law, such an invasion would be considered illegal. Furthermore, since the previous illegal Turkish incursion into Syria's Jarablus and Al-Bab regions, in addition to continued shelling of Afrin by Turkish forces and its Islamic proxies, the so-called Free Syrian Army. The Russian military had deployed troops to allegedly protect the region from potential Turkish aggression. In Jazeera and Kobani cantons, the US-led coalition, primarily composed of NATO members, was also allegedly acting as a buffer to protect their most effective allies in the fight against ISIS. It appeared possible that such an invasion could potentially trigger a number of serious consequences. Unfortunately, after months of testing the potential international response, the Turkish state realized that the realpolitik, which dictates interaction on the global stage, would guarantee them a complicit silence. With this realization, on January 20th, 2018, despite being only days away from the beginning of the Sochi peace talks, the Turkish state began its illegal invasion of Afrin. It was around this time that I had been working for some months in the communes of Kamışlı, and truly beginning to see how enthusiastically and fiercely committed people were to making their system work. During this time, I was afforded the opportunity to travel around to different cities and villages across Jazeera and Kobani cantons. The immediate threat of the invasion only served to intensify the people's commitment and involvement to the revolution. Being immersed in such a truly participatory, direct democracy, and being surrounded by people, friends, and comrades who were so wholly committed to defending and progressing this revolution had completely confirmed everything I believed about this movement. In the days leading up to and immediately following the invasion of Afrin, many of us, including myself, believed that either between the Russians, the Americans, or the international community, that someone would intervene. When after 1 week into the invasion there was no response, and after seeing the Russians pulling out of their military positions in Afrin, it became abundantly clear that Afrin was on its own. It was at this point that my fellow international comrades and I began our journey to join the defense of Afrin. We had begun the discussion as the invasion became more evident that it was going to happen. When it finally came, we agreed that if we were truly serious about our commitment to this revolution and to fighting against fascism, then we needed to join our comrades in Afrin. Furthermore, we hoped that we could possibly use our international backgrounds as a means by which we could force the world to pay attention. And finally, we hoped that by joining the resistance, we could join the comrades from Jazeera and Kobani cantons in showing the people of Afrin that although the world had turned its back on them, they were not alone. As our passage into Afrin was organized and carried out, news, photos, and videos began flooding in, depicting the brutality and human cost inflicted by the Turkish state. We began to grasp an idea of the utter contempt for life and disregard for humanity that the Turkish state was capable of producing. However, it wasn't until we arrived in Afrin and deployed to the fronts, and after witnessing it firsthand, that we truly understood the barbaric core of fascism. We saw how the Turkish artillery and air force engaged in a continuous and indiscriminate bombing campaign of populated civilian areas. We saw the aftermath of reckless and random shelling on innocent children. During the fighting, we saw how their proxies, the Turkish Free Syrian Army, were composed entirely of Islamist groups such as al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, Tahrir al-Sham, and even some of the same Daesh Islamists that we had fought against in Raqqa. The brevity of the world's silence intensified each day. Virtually no media was covering the illegal invasion, the use of jihadist groups, nor the atrocity and war crimes that were being committed and openly supported by a NATO member. At one point, we had a working television and were checking all of the international channels. Every channel was announcing the breaking news that the United Nations had broken a 30-day ceasefire for Syria. As we were watching this being announced, just outside the window, we could simultaneously watch as Turkish shells and airstrikes were continuing to hit our village and the ones around it. That same night, the Turkish army fired over 140 artillery rounds into the still civilian-populated village behind us. Apparently, it didn't matter that American fighter planes and drones, French artillery, and German tanks just to name a few, were 1. Being used on innocent civilians in an illegal invasion. 2. Provided critical military support to the same Islamist groups that each of those countries was currently fighting against. 3. All in order to wage a war against their most effective allies in the campaign to eradicate Islamic extremists and jihadist groups in Syria. As the invasion continued, so did the atrocities. When the gangs would enter a village, they would loot everything. They would tear down, deface, and literally dance on the photos of our martyrs. Those who were captured, civilian or military, would be subjected to humiliation, torture, and often execution. One of the worst instances, although not uncommon, occurred in February, when the so-called Free Syrian Army gangs captured one of our female comrades from the YPG. They proceeded to strip her, mutilate her, and drag her body through the streets, and filmed everything as part of their twisted propaganda. When the Turkish forces finally entered Afrin city, they once again revealed their savagery. Under the protection of the Turkish army, the Islamist gangs from the so-called Free Syrian Army commenced a manic spree of looting, pillaging, intimidation, torture, and execution throughout the city. At this point, most of the city had been evacuated by YPG, and many of us watched as a group of Islamists gathered around a statue of Kawa, a Kurdish cultural symbol, and watched as they celebrated, as they defaced, and ultimately tore it down. A symbol that wasn't even political, a symbol that was simply an image of the Kurdish identity. That day was only the beginning. In the months that have followed since, the Turkish state has engaged in a complete program of forced assimilation. They have imported a police force composed of loyal members of the Grey Wolves, a known Turkish fascist group. The same police force is supported by members of the Islamist gangs that fought for the Turkish state. The Islamists have taken power and created an Islamic council from which they dictate every aspect of daily life. Sharia law has been imposed and is brutally enforced through intimidation, torture, and violence, carried out by the Islamist gangs of the so-called Free Syrian Army. In an even more sinister move, the Turkish state has systematically been forcing local Kurdish people out of Afrin and replacing them with Arabs and Turkmen. The goal is to artificially change the demographic of Afrin from what was predominantly Kurdish into an area dominated by transplanted Arabs and Turkmen loyal to the Turkish state. Instability now reigns on the streets of Afrin. The Turkish Free Syrian Army Islamists roam freely to do as they wish. They have even begun to fight and kill each other over the spoils from looting and over trivial disputes. Where once we had a safe haven for refugees, we now have a region in chaos, which has forced thousands to flee, only to be stuck in refugee camps in Sheba. Where once we had a movement that empowered and liberated women, we now have a backward system of violent patriarchal oppression, where posters instruct women that their duty is to cover up and stay at home, and obediently serve. Instead of democracy, pluralism, and multiculturalism, we have fascism, ethnic cleansing, and violent intolerance. All the while, the world remains silent.